Peter, you can begin.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Welcome to our webinar, everyone. Our webinar, our digital summit on effective tools for understanding, managing, and accelerating impact. Now, do you ever have those moments where you stop and look around and think, how did I get here? Well, for me, this is one of them. I don't really know how we got here. What started as an innocent Skype conversation between two people, hey, let's do a webinar together. 4 months ago, we now have a webinar with 12 speakers and 400 subscribers. So for the good order, allow me to give the floor to Patrick Kerr for a short logistics note. Patrick works for COSA, the Committee on Sustainability Assessment, and is also the main technical wizard running this webinar. Patrick, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Peter. All attendees are in listen-only mode and muted. You can submit your questions on your GoToWebinar panel located on the right side of your screen. If your question is not answered directly during the webinar, we will send a document with panelists' written response later this week. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, you're welcome, Patrick. Thanks. So welcome again, everyone, to our webinar on our digital summit on effective tools for understanding, managing, and accelerating impact. My name is Peter Cazier. I will be one of your 3 hosts today. Why 3 hosts? Well, because this webinar is really the fruit of a collaboration between 3 partnering organizations. GFAR, the Global Forum on Agriculture Research and Innovation, COSA, the Committee on Sustainability Assessment, and GLF, the Global Landscapes Forum. GFAR, COSA, and GLF. 3 acronyms to remember during this webinar. Today I have the honor to represent GFAR, which is a multi-stakeholder global platform on agriculture research and innovation. It is an open, voluntary networked organization made up of partners working together through collective advocacy and collective actions. Today we shape together the future of agriculture and its role in achieving sustainable development through a set of collective actions and projects. These webinars, as the one today, is a typical example how we put GFAR collective actions into practice as an acting as a mediator between different parties with common interest, striving for meaningful and sustainable impact. And the word impact will come back again in this webinar. Our second partner in this webinar is GLF, the Global Landscapes Forum, which works similar to GFAR. It is a networked organization. The GLF platform is the world's probably largest and only science-led multi-sectoral platform designed to produce and disseminate knowledge, accelerate action to build a more resilient, climate-friendly, diverse, equitable, and productive landscape. The GLF platform connects a multitude of stakeholders, provides learning opportunities, gathers and shares knowledge, and accelerates action to produce positive and sustainable impact. Representing GLF today is our second co-host, David Thomas. David is the main facilitator and lead engagement specialist for the Global Landscapes Forum. David is already at work behind the scenes collecting your questions, and he will coordinate the last 30 minutes of our webinar, leading the Q&A session. Now, kicking off our webinar, I would like to give the floor to our third co-host for today, representing COSA, the Committee on Sustainability Assessment, Daniele Giovannucci. Daniele is the president of COSA and as such leads its global learning partnerships to improve sustainability practices. Daniel will introduce COSA, will share some of the state-of-the-art solutions developed by COSA's consortium of institutions, fostering effective ways to measure and understand sustainability and impact in the agri-food sector. Daniel will also introduce the next speakers. Daniele, please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us and for co-hosting this event. We really appreciate having you here and sharing this great webinar. We're going to go through a lot of interesting topics, and hopefully we'll be able to share some new and interesting ideas as well from our various partners today. So as you may see on your slide, our 3 partners that Peter just noted at the top for this particular event, hosting it. But we also want to make sure we acknowledge the partnership here of SAGARPA, the Ministry of Agriculture in Mexico, of Conservation International, who's with us, and also our dear colleagues from Farmer Brothers and S&D Coffee and Tea, who will together give you a much broader sense of how new tools in sustainability can operate more effectively. Okay, so you saw there's Peter's picture in case you were absolutely curious about his fan club. He's there, and for this first section, four of us will present to you a series of tools, a series of interesting and novel tools, including the different kinds of research opportunities that exist within the COSA network briefly. And so I'll be part of that. Jessica Mullen, who is the Measuring Systems Manager, will do two parts of it. Keith Child, our Senior Research Advisor, whose affiliation has long been with the CGIAR system, but also a number of other institutions as a lead and senior advisor or researcher in those areas, including ILRI in Nairobi. And unfortunately, one of our colleagues from Zimbabwe is unable, Audra Wilson-Max, is unable to join us today, so I will take on her brief presentation. So, to move things forward, let's just give you a quick sense of COSA. The first thing that's good to know about us is that we're here for the public good. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mandate is essentially, as it says on the screen, to collaborate or to work together on issues of food and agriculture, particularly at the community level, also at the environmental level. And that includes a multidimensional understanding of those situations. And to do that, and of course to make sense of these processes, we have to operate consistently with the my screen is flying here. Interesting. I apologize for that. With a number of other institutions. And so our effort to provide solutions has very much to do with the groups or the organizations that we partner with. And you can see on screen that a number of diverse kinds of organizations. Some are governments, some are UN agencies and development agencies. Others are NGOs, especially global NGOs, significant and well-known research institutions out of the CGIAR and of course others, universities. And perhaps most interesting and most appealing to me is that we understand that it's critical to have context in the developing countries where we mostly work. And so a lot of our work is through leading institutions in those places. So in Ghana, the University of Ghana, in Peru, the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos, in Vietnam, the ISER, the think tank within the Ministry of Agriculture. And that's really important because for us, the idea of leaving capacity over time is critical, having that partnership to both understand the realities of local, but also, importantly, for us to learn ourselves and to be able to share and to leave a capacity or an interlocutor that can serve for years on into the future. And the beauty of all of that, of course, is the idea of a virtuous cycle that as we learn in one place, we can pass that learning on to another place and hopefully achieve a level of collective impact through that process. So let's see. So got it. Okay. So who defines sustainability? I think today it's interesting to note that there are many different directions in this, and one that I'll note for you is that there are 454, at least as of last year, eco-labels out there. These vary from certifications to verifications to not much of more than just a label that someone can have for a product. From fisheries and forestry and certainly in the agri-food segment, there are many there as well. Some are quite credible. Some do a lot of research. Some actually do achieve the impact or attempt to achieve the impact that they state they're out to create. Others are simply all the way down to a bit of greenwashing, quite frankly. And while labels are very useful, some of the credible organizations behind them, the organic labels as one example, convey a process or an outcome at origin that is important and that's reasonably reliable. Others don't do it quite as well. And so the question is, what does it mean to rely on labels, because they're shorthand often for consumers who don't get a chance to look at the outcomes of sustainability and ultimately much of it is driven by consumers, or on the other side by farmers or producers who choose to select it. So this idea of harmonization is vital, right? We need to understand how well are we coordinating, how well are we being transparent and sharing information. And that's a very vital part of what we do to understand each other, to be able to learn together, to look at the same data at the same time. And that's part of our commitment as COSA, is the idea of having common metrics, well-tested and scientifically rigorous, that we can all share and learn from in the field. So in the area of harmonization, the area of sampling, sampling that we're showing you now of the collaborations, that just to give you a little bit of a sense of how we harmonize this process. You can see the FAO SAFA work that we've done. We've helped develop their metrics for smallholders. We've done it with a number of organizations, and you can see online in the slide there's the shared approach for smallholder measurement work at the level of the UN with our partners at the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, on the SAFE platform, and on and on. We do a number of these things, both for public and private organizations, and the purpose always is to keep refining the best metrics we can possibly get, the ones that are optimal in multiple situations. And by optimal, what we're finding is what we know is optimal is that it be obviously rigorous and clear and reliable as data, but that it also come at a reasonable cost. That's really important for broad use. So it can't always be in the realm of high science. It needs also to come down to a practical or pragmatic level. And for that, our scientific committee serves us well. We know that we don't know everything, and so we often rely on experts in that field from a variety of institutions and from a variety of perspectives: social scientists, environmental scientists, and of course economists. And they include some rather notable folks, including a mentor and a dear colleague, Bob Picciotto, who's the former Director General of Evaluation, the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank Group, and many others. And so we're really proud to have these associations, people we can rely on when we need to understand something a bit better. So moving on, we see that essentially, as we're able to look at these topics more intelligently, we want to understand that as we get serious about scientific solutions, that they're good, but they're just not enough quite often. We need to be able to accelerate sustainability, of course, but the solutions themselves just aren't sufficient. In other words, having the right science or the right data just isn't sufficient. We need to go beyond that. We need to understand the data. We need to make it usable or pragmatic enough for decision makers to take on. And I think that's one of the big leaps that we often invite people to, is taking a great piece of scientific research. If you can't functionally use it on a regular basis, or you can't compare it to other research to learn, it becomes much less useful, much less functional. So as we slide to the next slide, we want to understand that today especially, we're in a much more demanding space around sustainability, that we need to consider effectiveness at the very beginning. We need to understand impact. We need to get to our return on investment, if you will, and increasingly, since this is moving to donors who want to see their money well spent, in institutions that want to see their money well spent, and corporations that do as well, we need to really understand, are we getting a return for all of these sustainability investments? And that's a great place for research to give quick feedback, to help us understand very quickly where we are and what we need to do. So the problem with that, on the next slide you'll see, is it has to do with data. If those of you who've seen The Matrix will recall the flow of data, of sometimes too much information, or information that isn't functional. And part of our job with our partners is to help get those metrics into a functional state. So we move into what we call D2K, the data to knowledge. The idea of that transformational process is critical. And as you see on this next slide, we start with a very multidimensional space. And as you have these different kinds of data points to understand the complexity of sustainability, we also need to begin to unravel that, or to bring it into some kind of order. And there's also a third step that we take, particularly with decision makers, is to get this to a really lean process, a really lean space. And the idea of just the right data at the right time. In other words, measuring what matters. We repeat that quite a lot around COSA, measuring what matters. So that's important, and for us the D2K means, or the data to knowledge means, that it needs to be low cost, needs to be reliable, and it needs to be on time. So for us, that's how we move into solutions, right? Moving into the processes that make a difference. And so let me stop there for a moment, having given you just a little bit of a sense of the process of how we take things on, and let me pass the baton over to my colleague Keith Child, who will go into a little bit about the research side, or the impact assessment kind of work that we do, to give you a broader sense of how we apply those solutions from a technical perspective. Keith?
Thanks, Daniele. In this part of the webinar, I want to talk about some of the challenges we face when researching sustainability and some of the solutions that COSA and others have embraced. The reason I think this is important is that sustainability, as you've said, is by definition a complex research subject that masks some conceptual challenges. So let me start by saying sustainability is big, it's complicated, and it's slow. A thought captured a wee bit more eloquently by Louis MacNeice in his poem Snow, which is why I really wanted to say that sustainability is incorrigibly plural, and that the plurality of sustainability makes it a much more challenging topic to evaluate than a more straightforward kind of intervention that has, for example, a single cause and effect. So, while size, complexity, and time are issues that may be problematic for other topics of evaluation, they tend to show up pretty consistently when we're talking about sustainability research. Sustainability is big, and what I mean by this is that sustainability is a topic with soft boundaries. This is because the three pillars of sustainability, social, environmental, and economic, aren't discrete silos, but part of an interconnected system. Defining the scope of analysis requires a dose of pragmatism. For example, the subject of an evaluation could be a development program, a geographic area, an intervention strategy, or a target group. Narrowing down the scale of sustainability evaluation isn't always easy or simple. Sustainability is complex. As many of you know, the more complex the subject of evaluation, the more difficult it is to attribute a cause and effect relationship. Sustainability encapsulates complex natural and social systems. So what we often end up with are complex interventions introduced into complex social systems and natural systems. As complexity increases, so too does the potential for outside contamination, increased time lags between inputs and impacts, and the emergence of multiple causal pathways. And sustainability is slow. It takes time to see sustainability impacts. So we need to ask ourselves, how long should a project manager wait before they expect to see a difference in any one of the three sustainability pillars? Once they identify a change, can they assume that the change will continue at a steady rate? The answer to this latter question is probably not. The functional form of a project rarely resembles a rising straight line on an XY graph, but more typically takes the shape of a J curve or even an S curve. So if we make the mistake of timing our evaluation so that it accidentally falls on the bottom of what might turn out to be a J curve, we'll probably conclude that the project was a failure, when in fact, if we'd waited longer to conduct our evaluation, we might have concluded the opposite. So I raise these generic challenges just to help create a context for a discussion today. Very quickly, I'd like to touch on some of the trends and approaches that evaluators working on sustainability issues have adopted to overcome these barriers, increase learning, and also to help support decision making. So if we could advance the slide, please. I wanted to start with hybrid evaluation designs and mixed methods, because I think one of the most important innovations in measuring sustainability might not be technology, but a growing awareness of the limitations of individual designs. Michael Quinn Patton, who always has a good quote to borrow, argues for the need to move beyond fashionable designs and methods in favor of choosing the best method for the situation. As he puts it, the methodological gold standard here is appropriateness, not any one particular method. Most of you probably know that what he's reacting to here is the belief that a randomized control trial, which is an experimental design, is the undisputed gold standard. And I certainly don't want to diminish the value of an RCT or experimental research designs, but merely to point out that experimental designs have their strengths and weaknesses, as do theory-based designs, case-based, participatory, or even statistical designs. Personally, I'm heartened to see the increasing use of hybrid designs that combine, for example, a case study approach with a statistical survey, as happens in qualitative comparative analysis, or the combined use of theory of change and quantitative evidence, as happens in realist evaluations. The second positive development that I wanted to highlight is the increasing use of data linkage. By data linkage, I mean the use of different data sources to see the bigger picture. So, for example, combining household survey data with landscape data. And I recently read a report from the International Institute for Sustainable Development in which the authors had combined Canadian census data with climate change modeling to develop a community resilience atlas. It was a brilliant piece of work, and it wouldn't have been possible without the creative combination of different kinds of relevant data. So data linking is a pretty powerful approach, particularly when applied to sustainability issues, and I think the opportunities for data linkage are growing thanks to the digitization of data and the use of data sharing agreements. Finally, I just wanted to mention the use of shared measurement. And I know Daniele and Jessica will be talking more about COSA's indicator matrix, and there's good reason for that. It's a very useful way to bring about the sort of systems changes that sustainability initiatives champion. By shared measurement, what I mean is organizations who have a particular mandate adopting a common measurement approach and pooling their findings. By pooling data and comparing outcomes, organizations can support stronger conclusions by placing their findings in a broader context. I could mention other advances in the science of evaluation that are relevant here, but to me, these three are really key. Collectively, they help make sustainability evaluation cheaper, with less bias, and better facilitate learning. So that's really all I wanted to say, Daniele. Thanks for listening, and I think I'll turn it over to Jessica, I believe.
Right, thanks, Keith. Just before Jessica comes on, let me remind our listeners that you're more than welcome to submit your questions via the chat box on the lower right. Just select sending it to presenters rather than to everyone, makes it a little bit easier, and we'll be sorting through those and getting to them briefly. As Keith said, there are many ways to get to impact assessment or evaluation. There was randomized controlled trials, there are mixed methods, there are semi-experimental, there are many different ways to go. I think the important lesson to take, I hope, out of the many good points he made is that we need to adapt the solution to the situation, and I think quite often that isn't the case, especially when we have younger researchers tackling a topic. It is the one or two or three skill sets they already have. And increasingly, I think we're being called upon to look beyond that, to really combine the many, if you will, research technologies that are available, and the ability to blend data from big and small. And we'll have a look at that in a little while as well, when we look at the landscape level work that was developed with Conservation International. We'll talk about that in just a little while. But now let's jump to a little bit further along the scale to a more pragmatic use of evaluation process. And Jessica Mullen will take that on. Jessica?
Great, thank you, Daniele. Thanks, Keith. So now we're going to talk about our COSA indicators. And our indicators are at the heart of what we do, since it's literally what we measure. So while we'll talk about different assessment tools and approaches in this presentation, it really all comes back to the indicators, because they're at the core of all the measurement work that we do. So next slide. Thank you. So COSA has hundreds of standardized indicators that span the social, environmental, and economic pillars of sustainability. And we focus on standardization because it enables us to make sure that we measure what matters in the same way each time. So it's easier to compare data globally, so across crops or regions, and it gets rid of the noise that we see when data is collected in an inconsistent manner. And so while we'll focus on how individual indicators are developed in the following slides, we also just want to take a moment to point out here the importance of having a multidimensional and balanced set of indicators across all of these dimensions. This is important in any assessment to make sure that gains in one area don't come at the expense of any others. So for example, it would be unfortunate to see economic gains coming at the expense of the environment or social conditions. So we just want to keep in mind that broader understanding about how a set of indicators fits together. Next slide. We've crafted our indicators to ensure global acceptance and standardization, and that means having a sound scientific grounding. And so you can see here the international and normative references that we're aligned with. Our indicators are designed and evaluated using a broad participatory process with hundreds of experts and practitioners to create alignment with multilateral and multi-stakeholder systems. And the goal here is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to use the best of what's already out there and where there already is broad participatory alignment. Next slide. So we also apply SMART principles to create really good and sound indicators. And the principles are that a good indicator should be specific. So that means we want to measure the same thing in the same way each time. A good indicator should also be measurable with reasonable cost and effort. So COSA relies a lot on proxies in some cases, where it might be too costly or time-consuming to take a deep dive into one specific sustainability issue. This one's really important. Oh, go back. Please, thanks. A good indicator should also be actionable, and so that means making sure that an indicator doesn't just tell us ancillary information, but it's really practical, so it provides insight that can inform program and investments. Realistic, so avoiding theoretical and naive indicators. A good indicator should be grounded in farmer realities. And finally, trackable. This means that you can see change over time with your indicator. So often we see yes or no type questions or checklist type questions in assessment tools, and that just really doesn't allow you to have the, to pick up sensitivity to show incremental change. So there's something getting a little bit better or a little bit worse. Those are important factors to consider, and so we want to make sure that an indicator can pick that up. Now you can change. And the goal here, really the hallmark trait of all of our indicators, is balancing scientific rigor with business-driven pragmatism. And so through testing our indicators with tens of thousands of farmers, we've developed approaches that are both scientifically sound, but also enable broader application through simplicity and ease of use. And so finally, on the next slide, our indicator sets are expanding in recent years. So we're starting to focus on more and more crops, and also different thematic areas, so with producer organizations, resilience, supply chain sustainability, and we convene steering committees for broad participatory alignment and benchmarking where that's appropriate in some of these cases. So in T, producer organizations. So there's several where we've reached out to the broader community and are convening folks to engage the global community around different indicator topics. So that's the indicator piece of this presentation. And now I'll switch gears a little bit. So this is my performance monitoring tool at COSA is one of the ways that our indicators are utilized. And our performance monitoring tool is our lightweight assessment option designed to monitor key aspects of a sustainability program or investment. You can switch. The focus here is on a simple, low-cost tool designed to look at mission-critical questions of a program. So the performance monitoring tool does this by being an ongoing and continuous effort. So while an impact assessment, as you all know, happens at the beginning as a baseline and at the end as an end line in a program, and this is so you can see how much change and where you can assess attribution, performance monitoring is really something that happens during the lifespan of an intervention, and it solves the management problem of not wanting to wait years to see and understand data. It tells you in real time, how's my program doing? Are there any red flags that I need to be aware of? And because of this, it can help improve program outcomes because you're incorporating feedback loops to management. Next. So we have a standardized system in place with guidance so that this tool can easily be picked up and applied in the field. But like Keith mentioned earlier, there are methodological choices when implementing performance monitoring that can affect the quality and veracity of the data. And so this can vary based on factors such as where you get the data, from whom, who collects it, and you can modulate this to balance the right level of investment with the right level of accuracy. So for example, in a typical performance monitoring effort, you might send technicians who are implementing an an investment to the field, and they may use rough sampling techniques or collect data at a group gathering point. But you can swap in more robust methodologies, so adding a control group or third-party surveyors to introduce more credibility and accuracy to the data. Now you can switch. But I think the most important part of the system is the dashboard, because this is how the learning gets back to the field. So our data really comes alive here in performance monitoring, and our dashboards report on the process of conducting the monitoring itself. So how many surveys are being completed? How long are they taking to administer? It can show you locations of farmers and also interactive indicator results that are all automated. And the goal here is to provide quick and easy information for managers to make real-time decisions. But the ancillary goal, or the something that happens as a result of putting all this information out there in this one place, is that it enables accountability across the supply chain, because all partners and stakeholders have access to the same data. They're all participants in the process. And that speaks to our grand vision about data democracy, because this is a place where you can exchange and learn. It's not just about the evaluation, but it's about learning and sharing with stakeholders so that we can use data to create positive outcomes for sustainability. And that is the last slide of the performance monitoring piece. You can take it back, Patrick. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate that. And if you have questions for Jessica, your question box is at the bottom, or for any of the presentations so far. So this is an interesting topic then, isn't it? We go from the traditional aspect of impact assessment through to something much more lightweight, as Jessica pointed out, something that doesn't require quite as much cost, effort, or time, and has a couple of great advantages. One, it gives you a good sense of where you are because you're relying on the same indicators and some of the same rigor, but you're also getting the information in a lighter way. So it may be somewhat less accurate, but you're still getting a pretty good sense. The trade-off, or the advantage, is that you get it very quickly. And so the ability to have information get into the hands of decision makers, whether a project manager or someone who's making an investment in a company or in a CSR program, it doesn't really matter. In any case, having that data on hand right away enables you to fine-tune, to tweak, to adjust, if you will, the direction of the work so that you're more likely to have success. And I think that's part of coming back to the kinds of solutions in the science that are available today. Part of the process, just so you know, at COSA and within our advisory services, there are several things that we help people with as part of our nonprofit effort. One of those is helping them design from the beginning programs and projects that have the right metrics in place so that we're saving time, saving money in the entire measurement process. People often complain that the metrics are expensive in development projects especially, and if they're designed from the very beginning, it not only does it permit clarity, but it also dramatically reduces the cost of reporting and the cost of time spent reading reports, which we like to minimize since hardly anyone has time anymore. So part of that is working with organizations to map their realities and goals, their theory of change, if you will, or their objective framework. And then, of course, to help them define the strategic path so that we can begin to get the data along the pathway and not have to wait for an impact assessment, a 2, 3, 4, 5-year process to understand what's actually happening. And we also, if you can advance, want to look, and let me jump a little bit to the way we handle knowledge management. And that's essentially, there are 4 components of this. One, of course, is our ability to do advanced analytics and to transform data into strategic knowledge. As Jessica pointed out, part of the way we do that is by bringing it to life in pragmatic ways, and also by beginning to look at the returns on investment. And we do that multidimensionally. We are exploring continually ways to understand what are the social, the economic, and the environmental returns, not just the monetized returns or the financial returns, but also others as well that are demonstrable for a process or for a project or an intervention. And that's an increasingly important factor, I think, certainly for a lot of donors and development agencies to really see if their money is being well spent or if they could perhaps target it more effectively. Let me show you one platform or one way to look at that data and how these platforms can optimize the flow of the data to get the greatest value. So we look at data in rural spaces, of course, at the level of a producer or an organization, the community, and hopefully even at the landscape level, not just the environmental landscape, which of course is critical, but also the social landscape, which is governance and community writ large, and of course the economic landscape, labor markets, etc. This information can flow not just within its own borders, which is critical for learning, but also into, if you're involved in as many farmers increasingly are, in products that are being sold, exported, processed, or somehow taken to market, you have the ability to share that data effectively and data coming back about the market and its demands very quickly and very effectively. Go ahead, Patrick. The idea of having all of that data roll up your KPIs, your key performance indicators or your control points in one place makes it very, very simple to do that. And in the same way as that central control of data can then move into R&D and to researchers, back to researchers to feed their understanding or the development process, potentially to buyers who are looking for particular outcomes, deforestation-free supply chains, for example, and also to NGOs that are supporting many of the communities or processes in different ways. And so giving them information that's critical for their work becomes a vital part of the same process. So you're getting multiple levels of use. And of course, ultimately, it rolls out to donors and development agencies who are looking to learn and better target their efforts, as are investors, and ultimately the ability to even make a claim in front of a consumer. So the space for research data isn't just among researchers or with the project, but the ability now to take these platforms and use the same data in multiple functions, right? So that it gets much more value than it ever has in the past. Advance. So a clear way of doing that, we call it our sustainability intelligence system. And this is a suite or a network of tools and processes that can roll up into a dashboard and that essentially create 3 opportunities if you'll advance. One is that how we collect the data has to be increasingly smart. Obviously, it's kind of sad that we still have this archaic approach in rural space to how we get data. We actually send someone to visit a farmer and spend often hours with a farmer, with a producer, or in evaluating the environment in a community. And there are much more effective ways of getting data with much higher levels of frequency as well, which is not to say we shouldn't go there. Of course, the interaction with the farmer is a critical piece, but there are also many other ways of mixing big and small data. if the data is right, how we connect people to the data effectively, it matters. So it matters to give people the topics that they can decide on, the things that matter to them, so they can take the appropriate decisions, and ultimately to transform the sectors or transform the communities and the lives that we're interested in. One more, Patrick. A way that I'll show you a quick idea about, we're rather fond of dashboards, in case that wasn't obvious to you so far. The reason is simple, that you can start simple and drill into deep. So you have everything at your fingertips, and you have it ideally in real time. So as the data flows via electronic systems using pads, tablets, smartphones in rural areas, as it all flows into one dashboard that a manager can click onto, you can see the icons there on the lower left, and to deepen an understanding of whatever the key targets were in that project or the process that you're looking for. You can drill down. You can drill down by geography, looking at the map, or by specific customizable frames, like looking at the amount of training that's being conducted, how many hours were intended, which ones have been done, which haven't, where are you in the whole process. So you can quickly, as a manager, see where you are and make appropriate determinations. And so that's a really important part, we said, of this data becoming real. On, Patrick. Thank you. Another way of doing that, I'll show you a quick one that really has a wonderful ability to look at not just the supply chain, but potentially also a project using a dashboard. So move on one more. Where a manager faced with diverse projects, diverse supply chains, diverse anything, looks at origin, sees all kinds of things. If they're getting reporting, it's via lots of different kinds of reports, Excel sheets and Word documents and electronic reporting, etc. It gets too complex to manage. When you can easily flag the issue, easily flag a point electronically by having selected the parameters that are important to the project. Let's say you want to avoid certain key items. The data can easily flag, give you a red flag. In this case, you can actually click on the red dot in the map, get to a particular participant or supply chain or a project, click further to see the details of that particular entity, a processor in this case, see that the problem was a report of, say, water contamination effluent from a processing plant in the community, and be able to request rectification, request remediation right away, to be able to take action, not 2 years later when someone has it in a report, but immediately that week. So the ability to use data much more effectively is critical. And as we roll that up on the next slide, you'll see that one of the advantages of being able to see everything, including even the levels of verification, you can see levels of engagement if you're running a financial component in a project or training component, levels of compliance, and ultimately the ability to create scores for partners, this one for the Inter-American Development Bank SAFE project, be able to create scores that are very transparent. Anyone can see at the levels what score they have and how they got that score, how to change it. And so you can drive positive reinforcement in this way as well. Not asking someone to do something, but people can compare themselves and see where they are in terms of risk. And this works well, of course, for corporate supply chains, but it works just as well for development projects to be able to look at key areas or communities and see what the risks are, whether it's a resilience risk or any particular form of sustainability, since it's completely customizable to the theory of change and the factors that are important to the project. Let's go to the next slide, and let me elaborate on something that Jessica started to note a moment ago about the different directions or the different specificities that we've evolved with literally hundreds of global stakeholders. We can, of course, as we always have, been able to look at farms, specifically look at the multidimensional outcomes or impacts at the farm level, but also with workers, and looking at resilience at the household and coming soon at the community level, looking at gender issues when we want to focus on that, or next generation, youth, looking at producer organizations, and looking at supply chains plus the ability to look larger, a helicopter view, if you will, at landscapes and sectors. But let me focus just a bit to give you one sample of these at the producer organization level of how we typically would develop these and what's available to you completely freely in the tools that we provide. On the next slide. This one of them that we, with a grant from the Ford Foundation and with a number of great partners, I'll show you in just a second, is the diagnostic for producer organizations. And the purpose of that work on the next slide is quite clear and quite straightforward. It's that we were noticing that the capacity or the ability of producer organizations to operate well is often correlated more to positive outcomes than just about anything else. Even a certification or a financial like credit being made available or good training. The organizations themselves, when we're talking about smallholders especially, are a critical point. And we realized we didn't know quite as much as we would like about those organizations. We wanted to be able to diagnose and see, well, what is it that makes this one great and this one not, and how can we then prescribe some improvements as we go forward. So of course, all of this has a bit of a multi-dimensionality, right? But also the ability to frame it actionably so that a producer organization can understand and move the needle forward, if you will, for themselves. Next slide. The way we did that, because nobody's quite that smart about this process, everyone has a piece of it, is that we partnered with Ford's support with EURICSE, the European Research Institute in Cooperative and Social Enterprises, that is a global leader on looking at these topics. But we also integrated the views of a lot of organizations, as you can see on your screen there, whether the FAO or universities and many others. How did they look at producer organizations? What have they learned? And so with 30 institutions and a number of experts that, of course, included leading producer organization or cooperative leaders, managers in the process, we distilled a number of questions and a number of approaches to be able to finally get a coherent, concise, and consistent look at a producer organization without taking days and days to analyze them, looking at what are the key factors that make them effective and what are the ones that they can work on. And so on the next slide, you'll see, I'll just slip through briefly, that there are a number of social aspects of the organization, their management systems, their governance and policies. The next slide has some environmental factors like the services they provide and the practices that they promote. On the economic level, we have the kinds of business systems, their ability to keep records, their commercial performance, their efficiency in delivering their services. So there are a number of questions available attached to each of these indicators that we're evolving. And perhaps the nicest part of it is you'll see on the next slide, our POD, our POD, which is a way of looking at online the strength or the capacity of your organization quickly and effectively in less than 20 minutes. Anyone, say a farmer who belongs to a producer organization or an institution that wants to work with them. And this is critical as more and more organizations work through producer bodies or cooperatives to deliver their services to small farmers more effectively. And we know that according to the FAO at least, there are 1 billion people today that are members of these kinds of organizations, of more than 2.5 million cooperatives and such organizations worldwide, many of them in agriculture. So here's a quick way to look at this process. If we'll click on, I'll just show you, give you just a very quick sense, and we'll click through of what someone could do. They would get online. You can see it graphically. If you can't read very well, it makes it a lot easier. You can quickly slide through and select the ones that your organization supports. And after you go through that process, what you'll see is an insight that comes up online, and it gives you a little bit of a, if you will, an education or a tip. There's a didactic process, in other words, to this approach that with each set of questions gives you a little bit of further insight. And by the time you're done, let me show you another one, you'll have a really good sense of what it takes for an organization to be effective, right? What kinds of things. And so here you can see the different kinds of questions designed very specifically to keep interest. And then after you've filled out the questions, which are very quick and easy to locate, you get your tip at the end of it, and a caveat sometimes of the kinds of things that work and the kinds of things that don't work, distilled again from these 30+ institutions and the many experts who have contributed to this. Go to the next one. And at the end of a process, which takes 15 minutes, you get a score. And this is the easiest way to look at it. You get, in the specific categories that you've been asked, you get a score. It can be benchmarked to an average that you can see, that eventually, as more and more data is gathered, you can actually select what you benchmark to. Your country, cooperatives with similar characteristics, say numbers or size, etc. And you can see a way to tell how you're doing compared to others, but more specifically, you can also request a printout of all of the things you scored on to get a sense of how well did you do given the average or what is considered okay, so that you can actually see the specifics and be able to move forward yourself. In other words, to take action with the data that's there. Next slide. Okay, so I'll stop there for a moment and on the tools. And as you see, we're always looking at tools as solutions to a process. And let me go one more slide to introduce our speakers to you today, or our participants, to give you much more of a sense of how this actually works in reality. Among the integrated systems, back one, Patrick, among the integrated systems that are available, at the bottom you can see assessing impact, but once these are in place, and this is always a process, right? There are a lot of tools available. The key is to try and integrate them for functionality. Organizations can better track their performance. They can understand how transparent processes are or aren't, can check compliance with core issues that are there, and ultimately to be able to see and manage risk, whether the risk is at the household level, whether it has to do with climate change, social issues, conflict, whatever the risk is, it can be more readily perceived and tracked and even compared over time. So you can see if the interventions you're taking are actually improving those key factors that matter to you. So this is completely customizable, of course, according to so the data becomes functional for your needs. And that part of that process is always a challenge. It's a challenge for different actors. So I'd like to, as we go forward on the next slide, to briefly introduce this next section of this discussion that's going to be led by David Thomas, who, as Peter mentioned earlier, is our co-host affiliated with CFOR and has a wonderful forestry background, but also leads or coordinates the Global Landscape Forum. And he's going to talk to us about a little later, or help us guide the question process a little more effectively, as we hear briefly a brief synopsis of the work that's being done in trying to integrate these systems from different perspectives. So we'll hear first from Vera Espindola Rafael, who is working in Sagarpa, Mexico's Ministry of Agriculture, if you will, as a Director of Sustainability and Shared Value, and how for them these kinds of tools enable them to get their effectiveness to a different level. Their interest in really innovating and driving change, not just business as usual. And then we'll also talk to our colleagues from CI, or Ruth is representing CI today, Ruth Martinez, who's their Manager of Climate Change Adaptation in Farming Systems, and has a wonderful experience, has been a great partner in developing and co-developing the landscape level approaches that we've been taking, and she'll give us a sense of that and how that's made functional. And we'll also hear very briefly a quick snippet from Molly Laverty, the Director of Sustainability at Farmer Brothers, a leading company in the US, and David Pisa, the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainability at S&D Coffee and Tea. And S&D is a name you may not have heard of, but they're a very interesting company in that they're one of the, I think, the second largest importer of tea into the US, and are one of the very largest roasters. And the coffee you drink in many places across the US and Canada, if you happen to be there, is often roasted by them. So they're a very large and effective player in the field, and are using those tools in their own way. So let me turn it over one at a time to them to give you a few minutes a sense, and then we'll open it up to questions just after that. Again, you have a box at the bottom of your screen on the right, and feel free to submit your questions, and David will filter those for the end of the session. So, Vera, over to you.
Hi, good morning.
Hi. Vera? Okay.
Oh, yeah, got it.
You there? Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm there. Sorry, I just
Okay.
muted myself again.
No worries.
Good morning to everybody. I work for the Secretary of Agriculture, Livestock, Rural Development, Fisheries and Food Secretary in Mexico, and particularly on the Department of Agriculture. And agriculture within this secretary is the biggest component of it. And it has also been one of the strategic spear points of the country, with a focus on productivity, profitability, and competitiveness to combat poverty, and to promote a more balanced regional development. One of our main focuses is particularly smallholder farmers Daniela has been talking about. And having said that, we have a certain responsibility and accountability towards our people. And at the same time, as a country, we've also committed ourselves to comply with certain norms and global treaties, such as the ILO and SDG. As a sideline, so the government here in Mexico has a term of 6 years. There was a brief shift 2 years ago in leadership within the Secretary of Agriculture in particular, and our team entered in October 2015. Firstly, we started and we were assigned responsibility of the National Coffee Program, and since this year we also oversee 30 crops throughout the whole country. Back a bit to this National Coffee Program. When we started, we knew that to run this coffee program, we only had a limited amount of time, which was the remainder of the governmental term, which was this 3 years, all the way to the end of 2018. And for us, this was basically a clock on our desk, sitting every day, because we knew that everything we need to do had to do in a certain speed. But also taking into account all the dynamics that has this country. One of the things that we also decided from the beginning already when we started is that in order for us to be very effective with the limited resources that we had, we needed to ensure that the decisions that we were taking regarding the investments were put in the right place. And in order to know this, we also had to monitor this, despite the short term. We also wanted to know, as this team, how the program was actually doing, because there's a part of that we need to report on internally, but there's also a content piece that we also need to understand better in order to improve the national coffee sector and such. So having said that, we needed to have this data in a fast and accurate way, and particular data. So all these dynamics meant for us that we needed to work in a very effective speed. Before I go into that, so the coffee sector in Mexico has a population of 500,000 coffee growers, mainly smallholders. This means that it's one of the crops that has almost the majority of smallholders. Around 30% of them are organized under certain producer organizations. And this means also that for us, it is important that we work with these type of difficulties, which is reaching also to the other 70%, which are not formally organized on the producer organization. So this governmental program has been set up under specific incentive, such as nurseries, coffee plants, technical inputs, and technical assistance. And to have a better understanding if these incentives are being effectively used, we need to evaluate the full program from the beginning into the end, also including the beneficiaries, because it's one thing that your investment reaches in practice to the beneficiary. It's something else when you see, okay, is it then being used effectively by the beneficiary? So for us, it was the COSA Producer Organization Diagnostic Tool, which Danielle shared at one point with us, was also for us an important step within this monitoring process, because it allows us to see a first diagnostic of the capacity of the producers organization to which these investments are channeled through. And I mean, for us, it's not only to pinpoint and see, okay, you're not doing such a good job, or you are. It's more also to support the producer organizations to identify their strengths and weaknesses so they can improve. Because at the end of the day, we're all still learning on how to effectively execute public policy, and that said, effectively use it. And again, this is a program which is a national program, and we also want to have a better insight on how it's working, also because we want to see if we need to make certain adjustments, and because also we believe that these types of programs are not static programs, they should be dynamic programs. Especially when we see that certain support arrives to certain producer organizations, but other support still hasn't arrived to other organizations. We need to see, okay, how can we adjust our program in order to make those type of decisions? And in that part, the performance monitoring is an important other step for us to comply with the mission that we have. So for us now we're starting to monitor in this coffee program, and we are very much aware that it is for short term, and we'll be able to adjust certain things in the coffee program if that is necessary. We do believe that if we have these insights and recommendations fed back into the Secretary of Agriculture, we can actually also influence perhaps future public policy when it comes to coffee. When we presented this to the Subsecretary of Agriculture, he was also very much convinced that we were on the right track, and therefore a decision was also made to not only review the coffee programs in itself, but also to other commodities, other crops. And this is we're just starting with this part as well to see, okay, so which other crops are we able to give a first assessment? And we are working on a very strict time limit, end of 2018. And before that, we already need to lay down the recommendations for the next government that will come into place. And this is, of course, also the reality of working under government, that these types of programs need to be evaluated. Therefore, for that particular reason, because every time you have these type of new changes, having that information and results in can perhaps lead then to a better, longer-term effectiveness than just the 6 years or 3 years that you're working under. So, and it's also for us having not only that responsibility that we have to producer organizations, as well as to contribute to the compliance of the global treaties. It is for us also to the showing other actors within the change that what we are doing, and thereby really trying to give them the full view on how it actually is working within Mexico, with the particular interest also that we definitely believe that public-private partnerships is a way to contribute more to the improvement of the sector, like for instance coffee, and thereby hoping that more private partners will also support the producer organizations when we have these results, for example, come in, not only private sector but also other donors, perhaps. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vera. Fascinating, and I think the perspective of a government that has so many pressures and so many demands from every side, right? From obviously from the origin communities, but also just as importantly from the budget side, limited resources and many ways it can go. The private sector constantly requesting different types of support or interventions and policy. So there's so many angles to work on that it's easy to get lost, and it's also therefore all the more important to be able to manage data effectively, the right data at the right time, measuring what matters. And we really appreciate how the government has a very innovative mindset about this, about really being effective with the resources they have and being able to make a difference, and instead of the often long-term if you will, in many places, frankly, stumbling in the beginning, trying to figure things out. They're very much data-driven, results-oriented, and that speaks well, I think, for the kind of governance we'd all like to have, regardless of where we live. So, well done. Thank you for that. Let's pass now to Ruth Martinez, who has been. Oh, I'm sorry. We were going to do Ruth last. I do apologize. Let's have a quick slide, if we can, or a quick audio clip from Molly Laverty, who is with Farmer Brothers, the Director of Sustainability. And I think this very quick clip just gives a little bit of a sense of how, for them, they're involved in direct trade at origin, the realities of the farmers matter, and they need to understand those to be more effective. And how they do that in an interactive way, not just general data, is an interesting and somewhat unique perspective, I'd say, but one that is increasingly becoming popular and is worth noting as companies become more and more aware of the realities they're facing and how they can actually impact them. Patrick, can you play that quick piece, and then we'll go right to David.
Rainforest Alliance, UTZ certified. But what we really want to do for our supply chain efficiency is have the ability to measure impact and tailor technical assistance programs to fit the needs of local communities. And we want to involve local communities in the coffee growing world in the decision making to make sure that we're not being prescriptive and asking things that are unreasonable of our farming populations. That's where our work with COSA comes into play. We use COSA to measure sustainability in a way that's looking to take the majority of the burden off of the farmer and instead share it with us, the buyer, to start implementing the required changes that would comply with our acceptable criteria for sustainable coffees. So the first step in this is figuring out what we want to measure and what measuring sustainability really means. So COSA stepped in and structured a characterization study that gathered baseline information regarding social, environmental, and economic sustainability data from 100% of the farmer population from which we're sourcing. And this data is also collected from a control group, which is a group of coffee farmers with similar sizes and characteristics as our treatment group, to use as a measure of progress against which our program can be compared. The main goal of this study was to identify key critical issues in sustainability, identify both locally and regionally within our subpopulations of farmers, and identify any unusual or unexpected sustainability critical factors that were not on our radar. The next step was to share this information with our farmer population and gather feedback and input on how to prioritize technical assistance and investment to address these key critical issues. And I feel like this is one of the most important steps in our process, as the democratization of the data allows farmers to have access to science-based information about their farms and communities in order to make better decisions for themselves and be stronger partners for us.
Thank you. Molly in absentia, she's in an airplane today, and this idea that she raises about the democratization of data in her closing was, I think, our holy grail. ultimately, it isn't for researchers. It isn't even for policymakers. Of course, it is for everyone, for consumers and managers. But ultimately, if we could bring the data of the farmers back to the farmers in a way that it was functional, in a distilled, useful manner that worked for them, really served them, I think we'd be on very much advanced and on the right track to sustainability, because ultimately that would give them the power, or at least the beginning ability, the knowledge to be able to make the sorts of changes or take the choices that they can, obviously within the limits that they operate in. But that's one of the great challenges, of course, and I think we're getting there with technology, we're getting there with our understanding, and I think the innovation is coming, surprisingly, from the corporate side, and there are a few companies that are as innovative as S&D, and so let me introduce David Pisa to you to give you a sense of what they're doing with multiple partners to understand their supply chain and to be able to manage much more effectively the sustainability via this traditional structure, going down to very complex origins. David?
Hi, Daniele. Thanks much for the invitation, and good morning to everyone. Daniele, as you know, for us, research is very important, but it must have a very pragmatic approach. So for us, focus is paramount in order to actually innovate within the realm of social impact, to actually have that as part of our competitive advantage. Therefore, we need to use sound data to intelligently understand how our supply chain investments are actually making a difference and help us manage the assured supply risk, while at the same time manage the reputational risk. Given that, as you mentioned before, we produce coffee and tea goods for global brands like McDonald's or Dunkin' Donuts, then we cannot let problems arise within our supply chain that may surprise us or the brands that we represent. So we have partnered with leading organizations in order to develop our systems, and that's when COSA pretty much came in, because COSA has pretty much allowed us to focus on measuring what really matters for us. And by that, I'm saying that we need to first get the right data at the right time in a cost-effective manner. So COSA has also helped us to ensure that we do not only create our very own systems, kind of inward focus, but that we're also always aligned with global best practices. And I think that's part of the value that our partnership has brought us, for sure. So also, it's quite relevant to note that there needs to be a very deep commitment to understanding the realities of our global complex supply chains. And that's also what we have found in COSA as well through this partnership. So as I mentioned before, getting the right data at the right time, it's very important for us. And that's why we're very proud of the innovations that we're undertaking with partners like Conservation International, Supply Shift, and COSA to ensure that the content of that data is actually useful for decision making. And like that, we also see the effectiveness of our investments. So we can see the return on investment, not only from a financial perspective, but also from a social and environmental one. So the understanding that that data has given us, it's also helped us to pretty much to cope with the complexity and the trade-offs or synergies that we see within our supply chains. And like that, we see the real return on investment in a more holistic way. So I think the last comment would be that research is really important, but it's the way we have partnered with COSA specifically has helped us to bring science down to earth and also put it to the service of the farmers, ourselves, and our customers.
Thanks, David, coming from Colombia today. Appreciate that, your insights, and I think it is really that last point that's quite a powerful one. People sometimes ask, why are you working with companies? Why are you doing in the private sector? They have different incentives, often different ultimate goals, the profit, not so much the public good. But first of all, that's clearly changing, that companies, and especially the visionary ones, the larger ones, of course, like McDonald's and Coca-Cola and many others, our biggest Starbucks, etc., are beginning to see that their future very much is dependent on the sustainability and the resilience of the communities they source from, and that's not an odd model. That's a pretty easy to understand model. They're also beginning to realize that the investments they've been making, often millions of dollars, may not have been as well targeted as they can be now. And so the ability to use data and information to target the right investments in the right places to be much more effective is a very appealing process to reduce the risk in their own supply chains, to reduce the risks that they face. And ultimately, I just want to point out for those of you who come from a development background, as I do, having spent a decade at the World Bank, is that the private sector is increasingly making much of the difference. So we see rural communities where the public sector is often either invisible or only occasionally able to be there. There are places and certain governments that do much better than others, but typically a company is there frequently, several times a year, sometimes multiple times, creating transactions that matter to local farmers. And so the conversation with them, or the requests and requirements, often drive sustainability issues, or can drive them far more effectively than a government policy. So in working with David and with S&D and with other companies as well, that's the real payoff. We get to jointly get a public good or a public benefit that makes a difference, while there's also a private benefit. And so this ideal of the public-private partnership. So thank you, David. Let's move to Ruth, if you would, to Ruth Martinez, who is a manager of the climate change and farming systems work at Conservation International, and she's worked closely with us on co-developing this novel or innovative landscapes approach that is multidimensional and perhaps a little different than much of what's out there, and hopefully very functional for the organizations, the multiple organizations that commissioned it. Let me turn it over to her to get a different sense of what a leading international NGO can do, or how they look at this research data nexus. Ruth?
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to talk to you about the importance in global discussions between the interface of environment and agriculture, since these sectors interact and have impact onto each other. This interface is particularly important in the context of climate change. However, most efforts focus on one or another factor, and we realize it is critical to understand the environmental relationship holistically at the landscape level, but also adding the social and economic dimensions. The key of this work was to open the possibility of seeing the functional interplay of these three factors, environment, social, and economic dimensions, since they affect each other profoundly. So the innovation of this research work, carried out as a partnership between COSA and Conservation International, is to first identify the salient factors in these landscapes and that are most important at the environmental, economic, and social dimensions. The second thing that is key is to collect data, both at the farm level data, and make it available in a way that is understandable for decision makers, for example, by a configurable dashboard. And the third key factor is seeing in close time how these factors in these three dimensions enable an understanding of the dynamic interplay. And from this understanding, we can help drive better investments and more effective interventions. This, of course, is still in the developmental stages, with the first pilot wrapping up right now. We welcome many ideas from experts in this field and look forward to making it available widely in 2018.
Ruth, we may have lost you, I think.
She was finished. Go ahead, Daniela.
Great. Yeah. Okay. I thought we may have dropped you a moment early. Great. Thank you very much, Ruth. And just to say just a tad more about this. I think one of the fascinating pieces of our collaboration is that Conservation International has, of course, a wonderful experience in understanding landscapes at the environmental level, decades of considerable work globally. And the beauty of it was that our experience in working with the social and the economic landscapes, if you will, the conditions that exist, enabled us to really very effectively meld these processes so that we have kind of the best of multiple worlds. And the added value, I think, of bringing it into a dashboard functionality, of being able to use those indicators and those processes that we've developed in a learning zone that will be made public very soon so that people can access it, will enable someone to draw from the big data streams that are out there, things like deforestation, for example, and blend that ultimately with whatever sets of small data or the field level data, if you will. The easiest way to conceptualize this is let's look at the deforestation approach. If you wanted to affect deforestation in a region, you clearly would understand that that isn't just an environmental problem. It's also caused by, most likely, some social or some policy governance or some economic factors. And understanding those, for example, levels of poverty, levels of efficiency or productivity at the farm level, etc. Those kinds of things that are drivers of, or even poor policies, drivers of deforestation. You can begin to see the correlations at origin. You can do more effective research in these processes, but essentially make them available very quickly to decision makers, right? And so that piece is, I think, a valuable process for us all to be able to look at so that we can invest. And I think the many companies that invested in that were frustrated after years of their own individual investments, millions of dollars in communities, and not seeing results. I thought, let's step back and take a broad look. Let's look at what are the key factors that are driving results. Let's confirm that with the local communities, make sure that what our picture is their picture, and then take that forward into the next stage, right? So I think that was a really good way, I think, for us to collectively get the right understanding, get it at the different levels that matter, not just getting stuck in the micro, but really being able to look at the bigger picture issues as well that occur at the landscape, and be able to then determine or decide with the community what are the priorities so that we can move forward as a group. So the companies that are involved, the government that's involved, the NGOs that are involved, everyone moving in the same direction much more effectively. And so that's a pretty powerful tool in that sense for creating coherence and clarity about what's working and being able to track changes month to month, year to year, not just waiting at the end of the process. So thank you, Ruth, for sharing that with us, and we hope that in the coming months, as the pilot is finalized in Nicaragua, that we'll be able to roll that out publicly and globally within the partnership of the SCA, that was the Specialty Coffee Association and the CCC group, a group of companies looking at the coffee communities. So let me, with that note, stop where we are and turn this over to our David Thomas, our co-host from the Global Landscape Forum, to take all the questions that have come in, and let's spend a good chunk of time going through what people are asking and wanting to deepen or understand a bit more. David?
Thank you very much, Daniele, and thank you very much to all of the presenters so far. I mean, that was, from my perspective, that was just a fascinating hour and 20 minutes, and I hope it was for everyone else as well. Please do continue to send in questions as they come, specific questions we're assigning to presenters over text, and hopefully we can discuss here some broader themes that have come in. So just building actually on the most recent presenters, and I'm going to go to David first with this. There has been a mention throughout of the balance between cost and the depth that we are looking at for carrying out these assessments. And you mentioned the balance you had to come up with of the kind of cost implications of carrying out a process like this. Could you talk us through a little bit some of your thought process as you thought about the depth of information that you could gather versus the cost implications of gathering that information.
David, thanks much for the question. Yes, that's actually a hard balance that we try to strive for, but that's exactly why we have partnerships with COSA and Conservation International. With them, you know, we have with Conservation International in particular, we develop our sustainable sourcing guidelines that pretty much are a list of key performance indicators, very comprehensive, that we normally actually have third-party auditors come and check at the farm level. For that one in particular, we actually use like square root sampling, right? Like let's say in a particular group of farmers. But then with the distillation that we develop with COSA, which is like these key performance indicators, like we have about 25 that we actually have run in a larger set of farmers in order to get like a better indication of the trend that that particular group of farmers is actually going or it's taking. So like, yes, we of course go in depth when possible, but at the same time, you have to balance that with, okay, opening up to a little bit more farmers so you can collect that data in a cost-effective way, but also that like larger sample can give you a better perspective of what's really going on in that one particular region with that one particular group of farmers. So it's my point there, it's try to collect as much data as possible at the least amount of money possible, right? But then also, that's why we also heavily rely on our partners at origin. So we have created, like the tools that you just saw from COSA, self-reported like questionnaires or surveys that then are further validated within the data architecture that we have created. But then also on top of that, we have COSA pretty much seeing that that data is indeed good data that will allow us to inform our decision-making process. So hopefully I convey the point that yes, it's okay, like, and it's important to go get as much data as possible, but you must be also very conscious that our customers are also willing to invest certain amount of dollars into that. So like striving for a balance is key, and having the right architecture and the right system in place.
Okay, thank you very much, David. A very interesting response to how you utilize the right tools to create that better balance between cost and depth. And I think I noticed in the presentations there's maybe a third element of this triangle. And Vera, I may come to you to talk about it. You talked a few times about your time limitations, and especially from the perspective of governments and your limited terms and periods that you may have to work with. How, building on David's answer, how did you balance time as an additional factor into the cost and depth to make sure that you're satisfied in getting the right type of information for your assessments?
I think, and agreed with also what David just mentioned, you need to be very smart on how you operate. And perhaps with a private company, you have a less limited of a time constraint. I do think that everyone working when it comes to sustainability and when it comes to working with smallholders, we all feel a certain time constraint, especially when we look into external factors where we don't know on how long the time clock is ticking, for example, climate change. Going back a bit to your question, for us it was necessary that we needed to work with a partner like COSA that has the experience on what it means to work with country on a country level base, so compliance with norms and global treaties, as well as really knowing, okay, so what can we actually achieve on a short-term with producer organization, you know, and what is relevant for them and for a program that as such as ours that we're running. So I think in that sense, the way on how such a monitoring program is set up and what you can achieve with it and the speed were all factors that COSA brought to the table And for us, it was a no-brainer to work with them.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vera. I think maybe now, if I can kind of carry on this discussion, maybe directed at Keith a little bit. There's been some questions in the chat box about building on this concept of time, especially when we're carrying out impact assessments. Is there an appropriate time to evaluate impact? And is there a danger that some of this is being rushed in some ways by the constraints of projects? So how do you work in what the kind of the right what is the right time for an appropriate impact assessment versus the obvious pressures from project and again on cost and budget?
Yeah, thank you, David. That's a great question, and it's one that that I've been confronted with many times. It's often quite problematic for managers who expect, as you say, quick turnaround and feedback on what's happening, for donors who fund a project for a certain number of years and expect to get data back on what the impacts of that investment were. I used to work at, as Daniele said, I used to work in the CG quite a bit, and I still have my foot in there a little bit. When I was the principal scientist for impact and evaluation at ILRI, and a lot of our projects were measuring impacts that we expected to see 5 or 10 years after a program finished. And for us, that was acceptable because we were acknowledging that it took that amount of time for an impact to be visible and to be measurable. And we were interested in creating knowledge within the CG. So that was our primary motivation. That same sort of time period, of course, is totally inappropriate for a lot of donors or program managers. That's simply not welcome news. That impacts actually do take a long time to manifest, and particularly in an issue area like sustainability, that can be quite complex and not be visible for a while. So more often than not, I think when people are time constrained, it's a question of what are we measuring in our impacts. If we expect to see a change in stunting levels amongst in children, for example, that's something that it's just not reasonable to start measuring for many years after a program starts to tackle that issue. So I think part of the solution then is being very clear about what you're measuring and to have reasonable expectations about how long it takes for that impact to manifest itself. There's really no easy answer. Obviously, long-term longitudinal studies are the solution, but that's not always practical. And so when I was mentioning in my presentation about the fact that programs often, the results sort of fit on somewhere on a J or an S curve, and we need to be very careful about that. It's often a question that you can only answer by being clear on what it is you're measuring and having reasonable expectations, and a dose of pragmatism, knowing that an impact evaluation, unless we're going to do it over and over for many years, often it's the best we can do with the time and the money we have, and it needs to be accepted as such.
Excellent, thank you very much, Keith. And actually, you brought up an interesting point, which leads to some of the other questions that we've been receiving about. I think essentially being clear about what it is that we're assessing, and that balancing our time and cost balances, and all the triangulation between commitment, cost, and time, and that is so being clear about what we're measuring. We've had a few questions about definitions, and Daniele, maybe I'm going to come to you now, because I think to be clear about what your starting definitions are is an interesting questions and an interesting set of questions we've been getting, especially as it relates to potentially kind of broad or changeable terms such as sustainability and impact. So could you give us an idea of how you came to your definitions of sustainability and your definitions of impact, and how they may change maybe project to project or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. It took us 6 months, so the answer is 6 months to get to the definition that we had, which is that there is no definition. One of the things I do when I teach is the first thing I ask the class is, give us your definition of sustainability, and as many students as there are, they have that many answers. So we realized pretty quickly on that there is no single definition, and it's sheer hubris for anyone, no matter how brilliant you are, to say you know. You don't, because in Mongolia it'll be different than it is in Rwanda, than it is in Mexico. And so what we realized early on as we developed metrics is that we needed to have the ability to measure what mattered effectively, and that had to be diverse. So the only thing we know for sure is that it's multidimensional. We know that it's foolish to take this 1960s, 1980s approach to development that says it's all about productivity, it's all about yield, it's all about varietals, it's all about that. Of course that's important, of course it is, but it isn't just that, and you're not going to get that if you don't have the right environment, the right care of the soils, the right social constructs to be able to get to market, to train people, etc. So we know multidimensionality is the answer to, and is the definition of sustainability. Beyond that, we give people a pretty broad choice. There are literally hundreds of indicators. If someone has a focus on gender, who am I to say that that's not the most important thing there at that moment? It may well be. So we have a set of dedicated gender indicators. But what we do is also invite people, corporations and others, and certainly research agencies that we work with throughout the world, to also look at the factors that might be at play but that aren't obvious. So there might be environmental and economic and other factors. So we often ask for or nudge. We don't go quite to insisting, but we do offer people the option of having a library of indicators, literally hundreds of different indicators that have been well vetted, well developed, with questions that have been formulated and used in many different countries, so that we've sort of got that right. There are hundreds of ways to ask something poorly. There's only a handful of ways to ask it quite well, and that's part of what we've done in literally tens of thousands of surveys over the years, is to understand how to get the questions right, how to get the indicators right. And that's really from the benefit of having a lot of good global partners with whom we learn constantly. It's this constant learning. So there's no one answer. But there is multidimensionality, and there are literally hundreds of ways of getting to the detail you need. Hopefully that.
Excellent, Daniele. Thank you very much. And maybe Ruth, I'm going to come to you, coming from our Conservation and Conservation International and this angle of things. I mean, especially considering what Daniele has just said about the lack of definition for sustainability and all of these different indicators, or the library of indicators you have to choose from. Could you talk us through, especially as you're looking on transboundary issues and landscapes and on that kind of level of impact assessment, what was your organizational thought process that led to your selection of indicators or your internal definitions of sustainability? Ruth.
It appears she's offline now.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Maybe we'll throw that question. Then we'll keep that question for a later date. We have some interesting questions coming in about some more specifics, and maybe Jessica, you could be an interesting person to start discussing these ones. There's specific questions here about how you can use these types of kind of almost big data, big sets of information that are coming in to measure impacts on a community level. and if this is the type of tool or these are the types of assessments that are even appropriate to do so.
Thanks for that question. And actually, I know that COSA, we've been developing a landscape level assessment. I don't know, Daniele may even be better positioned to talk about the landscape level work that we're doing, because that very specifically looks at communities and other environmental and social landscape issues. Daniele, do you maybe want to take that one?
Sure. I think that diversity that we talked about earlier is a critical piece, and I think breaking down these barriers, these silos to understanding. When I once asked Joe Stiglitz, is a Nobel laureate in economics, about his definition of sustainability when we worked in the same place for a brief period. He gave me a brilliant answer. It didn't have the word environment in it at all. And if you ask the folks at CI their perspective, it probably is very focused on environment. And yet we all know that we need to take into account the other sides of each of these pieces, that we need to understand these pieces multidimensionally. And that's especially true when we look at impact assessment. If you're going to look at impact, it's critical to understand the unintended or the unexpected consequences of an activity. I think Jessica pointed out earlier, it doesn't quite help if you've increased your productivity, if that's your metric, by clear-cutting a hillside and having colossal amounts of erosion a year or two later, after which you'll have little or no productivity. So really understanding the environmental, the social, the balance is I think a really key factor in this process, and often opens doors for people. It opens a way of understanding something that they hadn't seen before, because we're all focused on our piece. And I think that's particularly true also at the corporate level. And I admire people like David and Molly and others who can see these broad perspectives that often are missed within their own framework of working, which has a very different set of incentives, right? They're not employed to try to solve problems in origin countries. So I think that breaking down those silos is a key part of that, David.
Excellent. And okay, so now we have some more specific questions. And actually, I think this could be interesting to throw maybe to David to provide some of his personal experiences of how this happened, and then maybe after David to Daniele to talk us through how some of his partners have gone about undertaken internally, how you identify the resources to carry out such an exercise. What was the back and forth internally within a specific organization to go about starting the process of carrying out an impact assessment, and what were the justifications you provided maybe within your colleagues and to your colleagues, David, about the justification for doing this? And maybe David, if you start there, and Daniele, if you can then maybe build on that, and are there, for maybe not-profits or international organizations or development organizations, resources available to help them carry out longer-term impact assessments? So first you, David.
Thank you, David. So the motivation was honestly proving the business case for investing in our supply chain, right? So by showing first, of course, collecting the right data, but then also having scientific methods that would allow us and our customers make any type of claims regarding the impact of their sustainability investment that's major for us. So it's all around like enhancing brand value for our customers through easy impact metrics that are easy to communicate at the end the final consumers can relate to. So when we, of course, see that farmers have progress, right? That's kind of like a broad topic, but then if you can just put specific numbers to it, saying, yes, we have seen how productivity rose by 30% within this particular group, and that's attributed to the interventions, to the investments we made in that particular region of the world within our supply chain, that's big. So for us internally, it's always a matter of proving the business case and make it easy for our customers to communicate and share those wins with the larger audience.
Yeah, I think my answer isn't so different, really. There's people often, and when I managed projects, would often get angry with the evaluators for the amount of money they wanted us to spend on tracking things. And I've since come to learn that as expensive as an impact assessment is, the only thing that's more expensive is not having it. Because if you don't really understand how you've invested or how you're spending your resources, it's a nightmare. And we have enough experience that it is scary. We can see, for example, entities that have invested literally millions of dollars in just one country, and to get almost no results measured at all of the scales, economic, social, and environmental, over the course of 3 to 5 years, no results. Wouldn't you want to know that if you spent millions of dollars? There's no way to know that unless you've done a proper assessment. And I think ultimately that cost-benefit ratio needs to be turned around. That's one piece. The second piece is learning, obviously. And as Keith alluded to earlier, that if we don't have this kind of data piling over time in a way that's comparable, right, so that we can see the lessons, we can see the best practices, begin to distill something that seems to be consistently functional and other things that are consistently not. For us, one of them that's quite clear from recent work in different origins is the issue of training and how it's done. This is the common coin of development, right? We train people, we train thousands of people, and we pay people to do that, and often we leave it just at that. The metric is how many people trained. Well, frankly, that's pretty stupid. It's a bit like the metric is showing up for work and just standing in the bathroom the whole time. You've got to do something, right? And so the key factor isn't that you conducted the training, it's did people get it? Did they adopt the practices as a first stage on an impact pathway? Did they then begin to get some outcomes or results from those practices? Are we seeing some evidence in the field which leads to ultimately an impact? So those pieces are really vital to understand, and if we don't have that learning, and that only comes from costly assessment, it becomes almost impossible. And I think that investment is becoming more and more clear. Certainly in major donor agencies, the case is easier, much easier now than it was even 3 or 4 years ago to spend that money and spend it wisely.
Excellent, Daniele. Thank you. And now, just quickly, if you could provide just a quick response just on another very interesting question that has come through the chat regarding the use of assessments and labels. Labels and certification, such as fair trade, the fair trade label and fair trade certification, and maybe the perspective that fair trade, for example, may have been a good idea to start with, but may have been kind of taken over or greenwashed by organizations. And what is the role of impact assessment in either assuring that that doesn't happen in the future, or providing some kind of strength to certifications and things such as the fair trade and fair trade industry?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, and it isn't just fair trade. There are many labels, and we work closely with ICEAL, the umbrella organization that has coordinated how to do much more effective impact assessment for their members, fair trade being one of them. And so that's a process that's occurring, and we've been part of that quite happily. There is, I think, a reasonable credibility for third-party or public labels, public certifications, because they use a third-party audit process to confirm what's happened or hasn't happened. And so I think organizations like that are just fine. It changes when you get into the private sector, when companies create their own metrics internally and put those out publicly as a standard. Then that's a much more dangerous game and much more readily prone to greenwashing, quite frankly, and we see that a fair bit. But I think it really is, this is the key, as you said, is impact assessment, and there have been some really good studies recently and some meta-studies, including one at a couple of good journal articles recently on the, for example, the economic impacts of fair trade. So yeah, it is, like many things, it's not perfect. You're asking a label, if you will, or an organization to help with the process. It cannot, with its limited resources, create full-scale sustainability in an origin. I think that was, really an unrealistic expectation that many people have. If they can make a difference, these labels, we can see that some of them are quite good at making a difference, and some, frankly, are not. So as you said, impact is key.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Keith, I'm going to throw a question over to you, and this is a very interesting question, maybe taking a more kind of history of science look at the way that impact and impact assessments have been carried out, and how useful have you found the kind of logical framework approach for measuring impact and sustainability historically? What has been the positive changes that you've seen with a new, more theory of change based approach on looking at impact?
Okay, good question. Because of course, when I started my career, it was all about log frames and the sort of silly linear change trajectories, and basically it felt very often like a checking a box and a process that we're required to go through for donors. I think as time has gone forward, it's quite right to point to one of the great innovations is more theory-based evaluations, and so using theory of change in contribution analysis or realist evaluations. I think we are starting to see a much more emphasis on learning and iterative management, and not having to wait 5 or 10 years for impacts to emerge. So these advances in theory-based designs, from my perspective, are absolutely key. And in both COSA and at IFPRI, where I also work, we use theory-based evaluation approaches and theory of change really, I think, quite effectively by having a really sound theoretical understanding of what we're doing and why, and how one change will lead to another change, and so on. We're able to develop what we call Sentinel Indicators, so indicators that give us a sense that when we see a change in those indicators, that it's very likely that the next change is going to occur, and so on and so on. So we can kind of project forward. So I guess as I said in my initial comments, I'm really happy to see the growing use of hybrid designs for impact evaluations. I think the fact that theory-based evaluations are increasingly being utilized, I think is fantastic, and combined with more rigorous kinds of statistical or experimental approaches is really the way to go. As I was trying to say in my presentation, I think all these impact evaluation designs, they have particular advantages and disadvantages, and so I think the creative use of different designs to draw on their strengths is really one of the more positive developments that I've seen lately, particularly since it's no longer just a simple cause and effect kind of program we're looking at. Often more and more often, I think we're being asked to evaluate really complex issues, and acknowledging them as such, and treating them as complex, which is something, of course, a log frame and more traditional M&E approaches just really can't accommodate very well.
Excellent, thank you very much, Keith. And now, as we're getting towards the end of the Q&A session, Vera, I'm going to come to you for kind of something which is globally, maybe it's a social media on-trend topic of trust, and especially the trust in the information that is put out by governments or other people, and how populations and the public respond to that. What role do you think, especially as you're preparing planning and processes moving forward and presenting options to the government, and then I guess as a connection to the public as a whole, what role do impact assessments and data play in this balance between the government, the public, and trust?
David, I fear Well, Ruth is back. I fear we may have dropped Vera on the line.
Okay, well, Daniele, why don't you deal then, seeing I have only 1 minute left of the Q&A, why don't you deal with this answering this question of the public and trust, and, you know, there's lies.
Hello, I'm here.
There is
there.
Yes,
excellent.
yeah. Okay. I heard the questions. I was following everything. For us, and I don't want to make this too long of an answer, but for us, when we started to set up the national program, we knew that trust is a very important component. And we also knew that in order for us to be inclusive, it really meant that we need to also include the voice of the producers within the construction of this national coffee program, making all the building blocks of it. And so the first, I think, almost 6 months, it was fully dedicated in going into the regions, coffee regions, and listening to the producers and listening to their pleas and the critical comments and all these points that were in some points valid and in others there were less, but it all made it much more of an inclusive program, which also led to having more trust from the sector within the program, which meant that any action or any activity you further do within this program will have much more of that trust. Did we actually win all their trust? I think we're living in a country which has so many dynamics. It's very, and its history, it's very difficult for its citizens to actually recuperate that just single by 6 months, so to say. So it is a process that is a continuous process, but we very much believe that that by doing these types of actions, for example, monitoring, evaluating the coffee program, and then showing the results to them, will lead to much more of that initial trust. So I think it's important for them to, and that's why one of the things that we are doing is to explain, okay, so explaining to the producer organization that we are involved with, what is COSA? So what are we trying to do here? That part, that initial part of introducing COSA to them and why we're doing it, that is really important because that makes them, for them, also very trustworthy towards this independent organization which will be evaluating, sort of say, the program as well as the organization.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vera. And that is the last response in the Q&A session. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions. I mean, from my perspective, I know in the work that C4 carries out and the Global Landscapes Forum, which I work more directly on, all of this whole discussion has been so pertinent and relevant and interesting and exciting. I mean, my big takeaways are that I think it was Margaret Thatcher or somebody like that who talked about there being lies, damn lies, and statistics, but maybe they weren't aware of effective impact assessments, and especially not these that were carried out at this level. So with that in mind, I think some of my other takeaways, and I think David made this point excellently, is that showing the business case and showing the value that you can have as an organization or as a business for carrying out these processes, I think is such a key element towards them. And then I'll leave just quoting, before I hand back to Daniele, just quoting him at himself, that his point that he made, that the only thing that is more expensive than doing an impact assessment is not, I think, should be everyone, well, is my big takeaway from today. So thank you very much for the Q&A, and Daniele, over to you for wrap up.
David, brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our guests, David, Ruth, Vera especially, and of course our team in different offices in California, Canada, Zimbabwe. Appreciate Peru. Appreciate your great efforts. And Peter, of course, from GFAR, the Global Forum on Agricultural Research. We're a proud member of a wonderful institution that shares information. And we really appreciate the opportunity to share that with you. There's a lot more. We've scratched the surface. Please feel free to contact us. We are collaborative by nature, and we look forward to engaging with you and helping out in any way we can as part of our public commitment. Peter?
Very good, Daniele and David, thank you. To all, as we're coming towards the end, as a follow-up, we will email all subscribers and participants the link to the recording of this webinar, so you can watch it and listen to the webinar in your own leisure. And we will also provide a link to the uploaded presentations. Within about a week, you will get a second follow-up email from us with answers to any questions which you have forwarded and were left unanswered during today's webinar. I hope also that you can join us in our next GFAR webinar on the launch of TAP, the Tropical Agriculture Platform, which is run together with FAU on November the 7th. And on November the 8th, day after, we have a digital summit from the Global Landscapes Forum on unheard community stories, where we will have representatives from indigenous communities, grassroots development specialists and youth, all working in peatlands conservation efforts. You will get a mail notifying you of these and other upcoming webinars and digital summits. Rest with me to thank you, all of you online, to join us today in our webinar. Thanks for your engagement. Thank you to the speakers and also my co-host David and Daniele, and to Cosa and GLF in co-hosting this webinar together with GFAR. Thank you very much and hope to see you in one of the next ones. Thanks.
Thanks all, and Patrick, great technical job. Appreciate your help.
Well done, Patrick. Well done.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.